Well, good morning. I don't know what this is. It's lovely, though. It's like a classical guitar intro. This is my walk-up music. I'm glad to be with you. My name is Matt Stone. I'm one of the pastors here, and honored to be with you in worship as Easter continues. One of the things that we mentioned last week is that Easter is not a day. It's bigger than one day can contain. And so Easter is a season, and we continue that season even to today. And we're going to continue the Easter season by actually looking back about 7 weeks ago, maybe 8 weeks ago now, at a conversation that we started that we really want to put a period at the end of that sentence. We want to kind of bookend that conversation for us as a church because it matters not only for our Easter celebration, it matters for who we are and who we believe God has called us to be as a church. So 7 or 8 weeks ago, we asked this question. If Easter is true, if Easter is real, what does it mean for our neighbors? If Easter is real, what does it mean for our neighbors? And one of the things that we discovered is that the answer to that question doesn't actually begin with our neighbors. The answer to that question begins really more properly with us. And we could probably rephrase that question. If Easter is real, what does it mean for how we treat our neighbors? And so we made a commitment, or at least we issued a challenge to us as a church, that part of the way that we would celebrate Lent as a season of preparation, as a season of getting ready for Easter, part of the way that we would celebrate or observe Lent is by a threefold commitment, that we would pray for our neighbors by their name, that we would find meaningful ways to serve them, and that we would gather with them in one way, shape, or form. Paul does a phenomenal job, the Apostle Paul does a phenomenal job of summarizing why this conversation matters. Why would it matter that we celebrate Easter by asking questions about what that means for our neighbors? Paul sums it up in his letter to the church in Rome in the 13th chapter. I want to read just a couple of verses to you because I think this summarizes, it captures for us why this conversation makes a difference for us at Peachtree City United Methodist Church. He starts in verse 8. Owe no one anything except to love one another. I like that. Have no debts with one exception. The debt that we owe, this is reframing it. The debt that we owe is to love one another. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. And I want to be clear about this. I want to be precise about this. To fulfill the law doesn't mean that we are earning God's love in return, right? That we have performed the law so well that God now loves us more or loves us just enough. That's not what fulfilling the law means as Paul is talking about it. He means more, you have completed the law. To love one another is to fulfill the law. To love one another is to complete the purpose for which the law, all the rules and regulation, the purpose for which the law exists is that we might love one another. He goes on and he says, the commandments, you shall not commit adultery. You may have heard of these. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not covet. And any other commandment, right? Not just those, but any of the commandments are summed up in this word. Love your neighbor as yourself. He summarized it. It sounds vaguely familiar, like something perhaps Jesus said. He sums up the entire law explicitly by saying, love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. It is the completion of the purpose of the law. The reason why it matters for us to consider, if Easter is real, what does it mean for our neighbors? Is because the answer is the purpose for which we gather. The purpose for which we have been called as a church. It is to love our neighbors, right? We've talked about this a few times. That God is calling us as a church. We believe this. Our leadership believes this. Our staff believes this. I believe this. God is calling our church to connect our neighbors with the hope of the gospel. To love and serve our neighbors. Mark and I had a little bit of extra time this week. My wife and I had a little extra time this week. Sometimes in the post-Easter season, there is a little bit of extra margin that appears in our schedule because this year, for instance, all of Atlanta left for spring break. So I had fewer meetings this week, had a little bit more margin in my schedule, so I had a little bit more time to just kind of sit around and chat. And so we were talking one night about trends in the church, and we were talking specifically about what's next in the church. We don't mean this church. The conversation wasn't about this church. It was about the church, as in capital C church, the church universal. What's the next thing, right? In a season that is defined in so many ways by a culture that is at best apathetic to the church and at times hostile to the gospel, in a season where both ends of the political spectrum use and abuse religion for aims or goals that seem to have very little to do with the gospel, in a season that is marked all too often by being mired in scandal in the church, and in which infighting seems to consume our time and our energy in the church. What's next? That was the question that we had some conversation around. What is next? In this season, what's the next thing? What will the church begin to look like? It feels very much, and you may feel this as well, it feels very much like the church is changing. Again, church universal, like the church is changing and morphing into a new thing. And we look at that too often with fear and not often enough with a sense of anticipation, with a sense of even excitement. That yes, we may not know exactly what it's going to look like, but we know that God's going to have a people. So that was the topic of our conversation. And we began to wonder, what is the next thing? And how, perhaps even more precisely, how will followers of Jesus like you and like me, how will disciples of Christ like you and like me, how are we going to make a difference in this kind of world? How are we going to influence people around us in this kind of moment? Right? How are we going to draw people in to take not just the church, but the gospel seriously again, as it seems to be ever more marginalized around us? What is the next thing going to be? And I have to tell you that my deepest conviction, my most genuine belief, is this is it. That the next church is going to be consumed by the neighbor. It's going to be consumed by simply and plainly doing what all of the scriptures have commanded us to do, to love and to serve our neighbors, to love God and to love and serve our neighbors as ourselves. I don't think the next church is going to appear because of a great program. Right? There was a day and age where programs defined the church, where great programs reached new people, where great programs drew people in so that community could form. I don't think a great program is what's next for the church. I also don't think that a worship style is what's next for the church. There was a day and age where new worship styles sprang up, and they drew people in. They reconnected people or connected new people. I don't think the next thing for the church, universal, is a new worship style. There may be a new worship style, but I don't think that's what's next for us. I don't think that what's next is a great new preacher or an innovative message. It was a day and age, and in some ways we're in that right now, where the great preachers of our culture could draw people in anew or reconnect those who had fallen away. And I don't think that's what's next. I think this is what's next. That doing plainly and simply what Jesus and all of the scriptures have invited us to do is what's next. If followers of Jesus like me and like you would love and serve our neighbors in such a compelling way that they're drawn into God's story, that they're drawn into the gospel truth for their life and for our lives. And it's already happening. The truth is, it's already been happening. It's been happening at this church before I got here, before you got here. This kind of thing has been happening in the body of Christ for a long time. And because of that, we wanted you to catch a glimpse. We wanted you to see and to hear what we see and hear. Right? For those in church leadership, we see and hear these stories sometimes a little bit more often than you might. We want you to see and hear these stories so that you can catch a glimpse of what God is already up to. But I want you to take note. We're going to watch a video. Before we do that, I want you to take note. Here's what you are not going to see in this video. You are not going to see that one of our church members has launched a global ministry. That's a good thing to do. There's no problem with doing that. But nobody here has launched worldwide ministries with yourname.com as the website. That's not what has happened. Right? Thousands of people have not been baptized in Peachtree City. You're not going to hear that in the video. Right? Entire neighborhoods have not been saved by Christ. You're not going to hear that in the video. Yet. But what I do believe, and what I think you'll see, is that God is beginning to do something through this community. God is beginning to do something through this body of Christ. And I want you to see it. Let's take a look. We believe that God is calling us to connect our neighbors with the hope of the gospel. We want to connect with them in a meaningful way because relationships are how we're built, how we're created.
I've got to be honest, we really haven't gone out of our way until recently to reach out to neighbors.
We have never done anything neighboring related.
We were very excited to know that the church was doing a neighboring emphasis.
This church is so community oriented that we have been more aware about neighboring and being there for our neighbors.
Sharing Jesus, with neighbors and with the hope of the gospel really has challenged me.
We decided to do a block party for our neighborhood.
Throwing a block party would be a great way to just meet people that we didn't know.
We volunteered to be the first neighboring event at our house where we had folks over who were members of the church.
When my neighbor who lived alone, she broke her foot or ankle. And so I went over and said, let me do your yard work while you're hurt. Well, I didn't stop. I've done her yard work for the last 15 years.
We had new neighbors, so I thought, well, I'll paint a welcome card to them, so I did that.
So I went to Dunkin' Donuts and ordered even more donuts and delivered those to our neighbors and just attached a little note that said, "We hope these happy treats make you smile and have a great day."
I'd say we were a little apprehensive at first.
We would never have done something like that before.
I am one of those extroverts. I love an opportunity to invite you to my house.
Throughout, we kept stopping and saying, like, how nice is this? This is so great. And people kept talking about how nice and fun and what a great opportunity it was to meet people. We did it so that we could meet our neighbors, but we found out so many other stories about our neighbors meeting each other, and now they have relationships that they've formed and they're friends outside of us.
So we texted back and forth and we talked, and we found out that we grew up maybe a couple of miles away from each other.
To get to know people who have been members of the church for years, it was a real great opportunity for us to reach out and to connect.
It gives me a lot of pleasure to help people. It's just something I've always been happy to do.
For me, it was always easier to go on a mission trip, whether that was to Iowa, Kentucky, Ukraine, you name it. It was easier to go somewhere. Going across the street or next door is more difficult because that's going to be more of a lasting commitment.
As far as us, like we're more familiar with people now, and it's not a great feeling when you don't know the person next to you. One of the things I really enjoyed was during the event was seeing these new neighbors connect with each other. And I don't think that would have happened if we hadn't got the group together.
You know, it was a great excuse, an opportunity to get to know others that live around you. It made us feel wonderful.
We have been not only encouraged, but told to love God, love our neighbor. And the only way to love your neighbor is to get to know your neighbor.
We need to give back. We need to serve God by serving other people.
I think there's a lot of neighbors that you probably have that are just waiting for that invitation.
Do what's simple and what's doable.
Just chips and queso and invite people over. Just something that simple.
There's something that you have in common with your neighbor. It could be a hobby interest. It could be a similar background.
The influence you have, you don't realize sometimes what it means. You'll be surprised what you can do. You might make a mess of it at first, but you'll get there.
If Easter is real, if Easter's true, then what does it mean for our neighbors?
If Easter is true, then we don't have to feel isolated.
It means we have a lot to tell them, a lot of joy to share, a lot of love to share.
If they haven't already, it's their chance. It's their chance to believe.
It's praying for your neighbors, it's helping out in your community, serving those that live right around you.
Jesus cared enough for us to give his life for us. And so if he cared that much for us, then we need to care for the people that are around us, the people he puts in our lives.
It means salvation for anybody that wants it.
I love those stories. There's so much to love about that video. There was an incredible charcuterie board that made me very hungry. That's one of the things that I loved about that video. I love Denver saying there towards the end, like, you might make a mess of it, but you got to try. And eventually, like, you'll get there. You might make a mess of it, but you will get there. I love that this is not a young person's game, and it's not an old person's game. This is a body of Christ story. I love that you heard some people say, hey, it's just who I am. It's what I do. It's what I've always enjoyed. And you heard some people say, this is much more difficult than I am comfortable with. I love that the stories that you heard, by and large, are just everyday. They're just everyday stories. They're ordinary, everyday, daily efforts to love and serve the neighbor that lead to extraordinary opportunities to change lives and eternities. That's what you're already up to. You are already fulfilling, just for instance, you are already fulfilling what John has to say about what it means to live the gospel. Let me just give you an example from 1 John chapter 3. I want to read a couple verses, and I want you to hear these words from God to you through the lens of what God is already up to in our community. This is 1 John 3, starting in verse 16. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. The way that we know how to love is because we have seen love. That's what we celebrated last week. We have seen love give his life for us, defeat death, and offer us now a resurrection life. And we ought to lay down our lives for one another. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses to help? He's taking us on a logic journey that I love. We've seen love. We have been loved. We know how to love. So how can we claim love and see an opportunity right beside us and not respond? And not respond. And he goes, this is the last verse I'll read. This is verse 18. Little children, I love it when he addresses me as little children. Let us love not in word or speech, but in truth and action. It's truth, it's action. That, friends, that's what we're up to. That's what God is up to through you already. And we believe it is what's next. I believe it's what's next for us as a church, capital C, and what's next for us as a church in Peachtree City. So here's what we want you to do. Again, we want you to see some of the things that we're hearing. Right, as staff and as leadership in the church, we've heard a few stories. And we want to share a few of those stories, a few more of those stories with you. And we want to invite you to share your own stories. Here's how. There's two things that I want you to do. In the main lobby of the church today, you can go and you can see a different set of stories as shared. Go and spend time. I know you're hungry. I know you're trying to get to lunch. I know you have things to do on a beautiful Sunday afternoon, but take a minute to just go over there and read a couple of the stories, because when you encounter more and more of these stories, you catch a clearer and clearer glimpse of what it might look like for you to be a good neighbor. For those of you who are saying, I'm too young to do this, for those of you who are saying, I'm too old to do this, go catch a glimpse of what some young folks and some seasoned folks are up to in our church. They might just spark an idea for you. Go spend some time thanking God for what they're already doing. Go spend some time thanking God for what God's already doing in our community. And here's the second thing. When you go out today, my heart is singing today. Do you know why my heart is singing today? Because there is a giant LED lit up map in our lobby. If you go, it's right by the coffee bar. It's a map of Peachtree City. It is one of the most beautiful things I think I've ever seen. But here's the deal. It's not going to remain a clean map. Because what I want you to do, if you are already doing some of this neighboring stuff, whether it is small or big, if you're already doing some of this neighboring stuff, we're going to have staff over there. Go tell them where you live. They're going to put a little dot where you live. And the purpose is not self-congratulatory navel gazing, right? We're not doing this to just feel proud of ourselves. What I want you to see over time is that God is already moving. God is doing something in Peachtree City, in Brooks, in Noonan, in Fayetteville, in Tyrone. God is already moving in our community. And it's time for you to join the movement. Join the movement of God's Spirit here in Peachtree City. It is not, by the way, a church growth movement. Don't do this because you want to compete with Southside or Dogwood or the Catholic Church or whatever the church is. We're not competing with any of them. They're great churches. Let them be great churches. We're not doing this to compete with them. We're not doing this to raise money so we can build a fancy new building. This isn't about church growth. This is kingdom growth. This is following Jesus at its plainest and simplest level. If Easter's real, this is what it means for our neighbors. If Easter's real, God defeated sin and death, not just for us. God defeats sin and death for our neighbors too. If Easter's real, we have to show up. There can be no ambiguity about what it means to follow Jesus in this day and age. It means we have to show up, no matter how young or how old, no matter how introverted or extroverted. I got to tell you, y'all have pushed me, by the way, which I don't appreciate. You have pushed me. Margaret is walking with another woman in the neighborhood because she wanted to walk, which is great. It's easier for Margaret. She's more extroverted. You have pushed me, though, because I saw a neighbor loading mulch into his SUV, and it hurt my heart because it was so dirty. And some of you know I drive a regular-sized truck, and so I asked my neighbor if he needed some help. And so we drove to Home Depot and put, 7 billion bags of mulch into the back of my truck, and I drove home with him. But in the process of driving to and from Home Depot, I got to hear about my neighbors, some of the challenges facing my neighbor's family. I didn't ask about them. I didn't start that conversation. It was just the showing up that gave me an opportunity to say, hey, it's hard, I know. I'll be praying for you. If Easter's real, it means we show up. Because sin and death have been defeated, not just for us, but for them too.